to bustling markets, and families toward the hope of new beginnings. Yet, beneath its shimmering surface lies a stark reminder of its dual nature, both giver of life and harbinger of death. The ocean's allure has always been intertwined with danger. To venture upon its waves is to submit oneself to the whims of nature, human error, and, at times, the unrelenting grip of fate. This is a chronicle of such tales. From the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean to the treacherous coastal waters of the Atlantic Ocean, these stories recount the final, harrowing voyages of the Batavia, the Essex, and the Medusa. Each wreck stands as a monument to the fragility of human life and the enduring spirit of survival. These are not merely accounts of shipwrecks, they are stories of people, sailors, soldiers, immigrants, and innocents, each with dreams and fears, bound together by the cruel hand of fate. In their struggle against overwhelming odds, we find courage, sacrifice, and resilience. In their suffering, we find the somber reminder that the sea does not discriminate in its wrath. As you journey with us, you will hear the whispered prayers of those adrift in the icy void, the cries of the desperate clinging to hope, and the eerie silence that follows the ocean's final claim. These echoes of the deep remind us of the countless lives forever intertwined with the sea's unfathomable depths. This is their story. This is their legacy.
The tragic tale of the Batavia, 1629. In June 1629, the Dutch East India Company ship Batavia wrecked on a coral reef off the coast of Western Australia during its maiden voyage. What followed was a story of survival and horror so shocking that it became one of history's most infamous maritime disasters. This is the story of how greed, mutiny, and madness turned a shipwreck into a bloody saga of human cruelty. The wreck The Batavia was a magnificent vessel carrying 341 passengers and crew, including soldiers, merchants, women, and children. It was en route to the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, laden with silver coins and valuable trade goods. The journey, however, was fraught with tension. On board, the ship's commander, Francisco Pelsart, clashed bitterly with the second-in-command, Geronimus Cornelis, a charismatic but deeply malevolent man. Cornelis, an apothecary-turned-VOC, Dutch East India Company, officer, was already plotting to seize the ship and its treasure. On the night of June 4, disaster struck. The Batavia, sailing blind through treacherous waters, struck a coral reef at full speed. Chaos erupted as the ship began to break apart. Passengers screamed and scrambled in the darkness, some jumping into the sea in a desperate bid to reach safety. By dawn, the survivors had managed to abandon the sinking ship and reach nearby Beacon Island, a barren, windswept sandbar. The survival struggle the island offered little hope. It was desolate, with no fresh water and sparse vegetation. Pelsart, along with a small group of sailors, took a longboat and set off on a perilous 33-day journey to Batavia, modern Jakarta, to seek help, leaving the survivors in Cornelis's charge. Initially, Cornelis feigned leadership, organizing the survivors into groups and rationing supplies. But his intentions were anything but noble. With Pelsart gone, Cornelis saw an opportunity to enact his mutinous plans. He declared himself ruler of the stranded group, recruited loyal followers, and began consolidating power. The descent into madness Cornelis's reign quickly turned tyrannical. He hoarded what little food and water remained, ensuring loyalty through starvation. Those who opposed him were brutally executed. With no Dutch authority to challenge him, he and his followers began systematically murdering survivors to conserve resources and eliminate threats. Over the course of several weeks, Cornelis and his band of mutineers massacred nearly 120 men, women, and children. Women were enslaved, forced into servitude, or subjected to unspeakable abuse. Survivors who managed to escape fled to nearby islands, where they lived in constant fear of discovery. The revolt Not everyone submitted to Cornelis's rule. A group of soldiers led by Weeb Hayes resisted his tyranny. They escaped to another island and established a stronghold. Despite being poorly armed, they managed to repel several attacks by Cornelis's men, using improvised weapons and sheer determination. Hayes and his followers managed to capture several mutineers and executed them, gradually turning the tide against Cornelis's forces. The rescue, unbeknownst to the survivors, Pelsart had reached Batavia and returned with a rescue fleet. Upon his arrival, he was met with scenes of unimaginable horror. The beaches were littered with the remains of victims, and the survivors' faces were gaunt with starvation and terror. Cornelis and his followers were quickly apprehended. Under interrogation, they confessed to their crimes in chilling detail. Justice was swift and brutal. Cornelis and his chief conspirators were executed on the islands, their severed hands nailed to posts as a grim warning. Others were taken back to Batavia for trial and punishment. Aftermath. Out of 341 people aboard the Batavia, fewer than 120 survived. The incident exposed the darker side of human nature, where greed and power can flourish even in the most desperate circumstances. Beacon Island, forever marked by the tragedy, became known as Batavia's graveyard. The Batavia wreck itself was rediscovered in the 20th century, and its artifacts now serve as a reminder of this horrifying chapter in maritime history. Among the items recovered were silver coins, cannon, and remnants of the ship itself, now displayed in Australian and Dutch museums. The Batavia shipwreck remains one of the most chilling examples of survival gone awry and the cruelty of some humans.
The Tragic Voyage of the Medusa, 1816. The Shipwreck of the Medusa, a French frigate, is a tale of mismanagement, betrayal, and human endurance that shocked the world and became a symbol of political incompetence and suffering. Its story involves a disastrous voyage, desperate survivors adrift at sea, and one of the most harrowing accounts of human survival ever recorded. The voyage begins in 1816. The Medusa set sail as part of a fleet heading to Senegal to re-establish French control over the region after Napoleon's defeat. The ship was commanded by Captain Hugues de Roy de Chaumaris, a man whose lack of experience and arrogance would seal the fate of hundreds. Aboard were 400 passengers, including soldiers, settlers, and officials, eager to reach the colony. Tensions were high due to the captain's ineptitude, but few could predict the disaster ahead. As the fleet approached the West African coast, Captain Chaumaris made critical errors, ignoring warnings from his officers and charts showing dangerous shallows. On July 2, the Medusa ran aground on the Bank d'Arguin, a sandbank off Mauritania. Attempts to free the ship failed, and panic set in as it became clear the frigate would not budge. The captain ordered an evacuation, but the lifeboats were insufficient for all aboard. To save themselves, the officers devised a desperate plan. A makeshift raft, constructed from ship timbers, would carry the surplus passengers, while the lifeboats towed it to shore. The raft of the Medusa, hastily built and dangerously overcrowded, carried 147 men and 1 woman. It was barely seaworthy and sank low in the water under the weight of its passengers. Supplies were limited to a few barrels of wine, casks of water, and some biscuits. On July 5, the lifeboats set off, towing the raft behind them. Chaos erupted almost immediately as the rough seas made progress slow. In a horrifying act of betrayal, the officers cut the ropes, abandoning the raft to its fate. The lifeboats, carrying the wealthy and powerful, made their way to shore, leaving those on the raft to drift helplessly in the open ocean. The next 13 days on the raft were a nightmare. Packed shoulder to shoulder, the passengers were exposed to the scorching sun by day and freezing cold by night. The scant provisions were quickly depleted. Hunger and thirst drove the survivors to madness. Arguments erupted into violence, and the strongest began throwing the weak and wounded overboard to conserve resources. When the food ran out, the survivors turned to cannibalism, consuming the bodies of those who had perished. Even this grim sustenance was insufficient. By the 5th day, over 60 people had died. The raft was a scene of unimaginable horror, emaciated bodies, rotting corpses, and bloodied survivors fighting to stay alive. A glimmer of hope on the 12th day, the survivors spotted a ship on the horizon. They signaled frantically, but it passed by without noticing them. Despair set in again, but fate intervened. On July 17, the French brig Argus, searching for survivors, spotted the raft. By then, only 15 of the original 147 passengers were still alive, and 5 of them died shortly after rescue. The survivors were brought to St. Louis, Senegal, where their story quickly spread. Public outrage grew when details of the abandonment and suffering on the raft were revealed. Captain Chaumaris and his officers faced a court-martial. Chaumaris was convicted of incompetence but received only a light sentence, 3 years in prison. The tragedy of the Medusa became a symbol of political corruption and the failures of the French monarchy, which had appointed the unqualified captain for political reasons. It also ignited debates about maritime safety and accountability. The legacy of the Medusa. The story of the Medusa found its place in art and literature. Théodore Géricault's monumental painting, The Raft of the Medusa, immortalized the event, depicting the suffering and desperation of the survivors with unflinching realism. The painting became a powerful indictment of governmental incompetence and human cruelty. The shipwreck of the Medusa is remembered not only for the horror its victims endured but also for its profound impact on public consciousness. It remains a haunting reminder of the thin veneer of civilization and the extremes humans can reach when faced with survival.
The Wreck of the Essex, 1820, a tale of survival and despair. The wreck of the Essex is one of the most harrowing stories of maritime survival ever told. A Nantucket whaling ship sunk by a massive sperm whale in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The voyage begins. The Essex sailed from Nantucket in August 1819, under the command of Captain George Pollard, Jr., with 20 crew members aboard. Their mission, to hunt whales for oil, the lifeblood of the growing industrial age. The ship's crew, composed of seasoned whalers and young greenhands, was eager for a profitable voyage. Early signs of trouble emerged when the Essex was struck by a squall in the Atlantic, damaging its masts and nearly sinking the ship. Against better judgment, Captain Pollard chose to press on rather than return to port for repairs. The ship rounded Cape Horn and entered the Pacific, heading to the lucrative whaling grounds near the Galapagos Islands. After months of limited success, tensions among the crew rose. They hunted relentlessly, unaware that disaster loomed. The attack on November 20, 1820, the Essex was 2,000 miles west of South America. The crew had lowered 3 small whaleboats to pursue a pod of sperm whales. While the boats were at sea, a massive bull sperm whale, estimated to be 85 feet long, charged the ship. The whale rammed the Essex twice, smashing its bow and causing irreparable damage. Within minutes, the ship began to sink. The crew hurriedly salvaged what they could, some navigational instruments, a small supply of food and water, and a few tools. As the Essex slipped beneath the waves, the crew found themselves stranded in 3 small whaleboats in one of the most remote parts of the Pacific Ocean. Adrift in the Pacific, the situation was dire. The crew faced 3 critical challenges: limited provisions, exposure to the elements, and the vast distances to potential rescue. Captain Pollard made the fateful decision to head for South America, 2,500 miles away, instead of the closer Marquesas Islands, fearing the latter might be inhabited by cannibals, a tragic irony given what would follow. The whaleboats set off, navigating by sextant and relying on prevailing winds and currents. The men rationed their scant supplies, but thirst and hunger quickly became unbearable. The descent into desperation. After weeks at sea, starvation began to take its toll. The crew consumed the hardtack biscuits they had saved, only to discover they were infested with seawater and maggots. They drank small amounts of water and even resorted to drinking their own urine to stave off dehydration. One by one, crew members began to die. The survivors, driven by desperation, turned to cannibalism, consuming the flesh of their dead shipmates to survive. The decision was grim but unavoidable. Separation and death. The three whaleboats eventually became separated. In Pollard's boat, the crew faced an agonizing choice when their provisions ran out completely, drawing lots to determine who would die to sustain the others. Pollard's young cousin, Owen, drew the short straw. Despite Pollard's offer to take his place, Owen insisted on accepting his fate. He was shot and eaten by his crewmates. In First Mate Owen Chase's boat was dire. By the time they were rescued by a passing ship, only 3 of the original 6 crew members were alive, skeletal and barely able to move. The third boat disappeared entirely, its fate unknown. The rescue in February 1821, after 95 days at sea, Pollard's boat was finally rescued by the Dauphin, a Nantucket whale ship. The crew discovered the survivors clutching the bones of their dead companions, gnawed clean in their desperate bid for survival. Pollard, broken and emaciated, had endured unimaginable horrors. Aftermath of the original 20 crew members, only 8 survived. Captain Pollard returned to Nantucket, where he was shunned by many who found the story of cannibalism too horrific to accept. Pollard attempted another whaling voyage, but his second ship wrecked as well. He spent the remainder of his life as a night watchman, haunted by the memory of his lost crew. First Mate Owen Chase chronicled the ordeal in a book, Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whaleship Essex. His account, filled with vivid detail and unflinching honesty, reached Herman Melville years later, inspiring the great novel, Moby Dick.
The year was 1838, a time when steamboats ruled the waterways of America, symbolizing progress, industry, and adventure. Among them, the Moselle was a masterpiece of engineering and elegance, a shining beacon of innovation that promised speed and luxury to its passengers. Built in Cincinnati, Ohio, the Moselle was the pride of the burgeoning steamboat industry, boasting a sleek design and state-of-the-art engines. Little did anyone know, however, that this marvel of modern technology would soon be the centerpiece of one of the most tragic disasters in early American history. The Moselle was owned and captained by Isaac Perrin, a man whose ambition for speed was both his trademark and his downfall. Known for his determination to outpace any vessel on the Ohio River, Perrin often pushed the Moselle's engines to their limits. Passengers marveled at the boat's speed as it cut through the water, its twin smokestacks belching black plumes into the sky. But beneath the surface of this awe-inspiring spectacle, a dangerous reality simmered. On April 25, 1838, the Moselle embarked on what was to be a routine journey from Cincinnati to St. Louis. The docks buzzed with excitement as passengers, many of them immigrants seeking new opportunities in the American West, boarded the steamboat. Families clutched their belongings, their faces alight with hope and anticipation. Merchants loaded goods onto the decks, and the crew prepared for departure. The Moselle was packed to capacity, carrying over 200 passengers and crew. As the steamboat began its journey, Captain Perrin was determined to showcase its speed. The Moselle raced upriver, overtaking other vessels with ease. Its powerful engines roared, and the passengers cheered, oblivious to the mounting pressure within the boilers below deck. The mood on board was jubilant as the boat made a brief stop at Fulton, a small suburb of Cincinnati, to pick up additional passengers. What happened next would haunt the memories of those who survived and become a grim warning to future generations. As the Moselle prepared to depart Fulton, Captain Perrin ordered the crew to increase steam pressure in a bid to make a dramatic exit. The boilers, already strained from the captain's penchant for speed, were pushed beyond their safe limits. Just as the boat cast off, a thunderous explosion tore through the vessel. The force of the blast was catastrophic. The Moselle's boilers had exploded, sending shards of metal and scalding steam in all directions. The deck was splintered into fragments, and passengers were hurled into the air or plunged into the river. Fires broke out, consuming the wreckage, while the once mighty steamboat was reduced to a floating inferno. Panic gripped the survivors. Families were torn apart in the chaos, their cries for help echoing across the water. Local residents and other boat crews rushed to the scene, pulling survivors from the river and tending to the wounded. In the aftermath of the explosion, the full scale of the tragedy became apparent. More than 150 lives were lost, including Captain Perrin, making it one of the deadliest steamboat disasters of the era. The Moselle, once a symbol of progress, had become a cautionary tale of hubris and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Investigations revealed that the explosion was caused by excessive boiler pressure, a direct result of Captain Perrin's relentless drive for speed. The disaster of the Moselle sent shockwaves through the nation, sparking public outcry and calls for stricter safety regulations in the steamboat industry. Engineers and legislators began to advocate for the use of safety valves and mandatory inspections, measures that would eventually become standard practice. Though these reforms came too late for the victims of the Moselle, they marked a turning point in the pursuit of safer travel. Today, the story of the Moselle serves as a poignant reminder of the human cost of progress. The river where it met its tragic end remains silent, but its waters carry the echoes of those who perished and the lessons their sacrifice imparted. It is a story of ambition and tragedy, a chapter in the history of American innovation that underscores the need for responsibility and caution in the face of great achievement.